You know, so what happens in a covenant? So here again, I'll use Jonathan. So there's things that we would do. So we would come out, the royal families would be together, the leaders, the army, the generals, everybody would be there. And I say I'm a prince in my nation, Jonathan's a prince in his nation. I would take off my robe, because when I walk down the streets of my city, they know I'm royalty, right? They would see the purple coloring, the expensive clothing, the gold leaf, whatever it may be. You know, Sebastian is a prince in his nation, right? And Jonathan would have the same. I would take off my robe, and I would give it to Jonathan, and Jonathan would give me his robe, which now I would put on, and I would become a prince in his nation. I would become a part of his nation. Generally, in history, we see that there would be a marriage. He would marry a princess, I would marry a princess. Back then, you could have several wives, but it would be a binding together where now I would have a position in that nation, and he would have a position in our nation, right? We become one, right? We'd exchange a weapon. So I would take a sword or a spear, and I would give it to him, and he would give it to me. And what this meant is I would defend and protect you to the death. And I would expect the same, back and forth. In other words, my armies are your armies. We're there for your protection. We're also there for your offense. We're there, we're connecting militarily, right? Okay, the next thing we do is we'd exchange a name, which is like a power of attorney. Abram became Abraham, right? We're going to study that. But we'd exchange a name. In the marriage covenant, there's an exchange of a name, right? And this is not just a name, it's actually power of attorney. You can transact in my name, and I can transact in your name, right? And without pre-approval. There'd be a sacrifice. An animal would be killed, and it would be split the long way. They'd separate the pieces in the long way, and then me and the other mediator, Jonathan, would pass between the pieces in a sideways figure eight. And generally, we recite the terms of the covenant, the terms of the agreement. This is where we get the sign for infinity. Ever see the sign for infinity? It's a sideways eight, right? So we'd pass between the pieces, and this is basically saying that we're one now. And here are the terms, these blessings. You're going to have access to our ports. You're going to have this. You're going to have that. And I'm going to give you this, and I'm going to give you that, right? The next thing we would do is Jonathan and myself would cut our thumbs, our wrist, our hand, and this is where we get the handshake. We'd mingle blood. Okay, so that means what's in me is now in him. That means generations. The blood now means generations, right? Because we're one. What's inside of me is inside of him, and what's inside of him is inside of me, right? And so we'd mingle that blood. We would usually make a scar. So when both teams, Livingstone and the other team, Lewis, when they went in, they would make a scar. So in Africa, they would have scars. So if they got apprehended by the next tribe, they'd pull up their sleeves and they would see a scar saying, those guys are in covenant with me. So if you touch me, you're touching them. They're going to come to you, right? And that's how they got through indigenous territories. Here in North America as well. They made covenants with tribes as they went, basically saying we're a part of this, of one together, and we move together. So we'd have a scar. The terms of the covenant are, here's the blessings you're going to have. Here's the cursings that'll come. There's always a covenant meal where there'd be oil and wine, right? And there'd be bread, right? And so we would do this covenant meal once, but we would do it on a repetitive basis so that the generations of royalty between the nations or tribes would get to meet with each other once a year at least. And they would share and break bread, oil, wine together. And this would train up the next generation to continue and perpetuate the covenant, right? And so there'd be a memorial. You know, the cross is ours, right? So they would plant a statue, give a statue, you know, make a rock formation, make something that would memorialize and live through generations, right? You know, and so they would do all of these things. They would go in, and all of these things would be done to make an agreement between the two entities, right?